Hi everyone, this is Mark Davis and welcome back to our weekly text study on the Gospel of Mark here at St. Mark. You can see that we are in our next to the last class for this year. We will resume our text study after the first of the year. And so next week we'll read the remainder of Mark chapter 10, and today we're looking at verses 35 through 45. So let's read it together. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to Jesus and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called to them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." All right, this ends the reading. And what I'd like to do just before we delve into these particular verses is to back up a couple of verses, because there's a very important context that's happening here. In verses 33 and 34, Jesus discloses to the disciples for the third time that he is going to die and to be raised. And so I think that's an important context for understanding the conversation that happens in verses 35 through 45. I'm not entirely sure why verses 33 through 34 are not part of the lectionary reading for Sunday, but I want to make sure you see that. This is the third time Jesus discloses his death and resurrection. It's the third time that with that disclosure, there's a problematic response by the disciples. And it's the third time that Jesus ends up offering a paradoxical statement about himself and about being disciples. So let's look at that. Back in Mark chapter 8, verse 31, is the first disclosure where Jesus tells them the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, be rejected by elders, chief priests, and scribes, and killed, and after 3 days rise again. I'm only reading that because I'm sure the print is kind of small, because I want to fit all three disclosures on one screen. So that's in chapter 8. And then in chapter 9, Jesus says, again, the Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again. So we've got chapters 8 and 9, the first and second disclosure, and then in chapter 10, we have the third. What immediately precedes our text: the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him and spit upon him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise again. All right, so notice that in all three disclosures, we continue to have the phrase Son of Man as Jesus' way of describing himself, particularly when it comes to his death. Notice that in all three, there is the language of the Son of Man being killed and rising on the third day. Notice in all three there's some attribution to human agency. It changes from time to time, but there is human agency involved in the rejection, the suffering, the death. And notice that the third disclosure is a little more explicit about the role of the Gentiles. Gentiles, remember that. It's going to come back up in our verses that we already read, verses 35 through 45. The third disclosure shows it's the Gentiles. Jesus is rejected by the Jews. He's handed over for death, but he's killed by the Gentiles. And the third disclosure is also more explicit about the treatment that Jesus will get. They'll mock him, spit upon him, flog him. So we've got a little more information there. All right, so you've got these three disclosures that happen in chapters 8, 9, and 10. And with each of those, there's something that follows. Remember back in chapter 8, when Jesus says he's going to die and be raised, Peter takes him aside and rebukes him. Peter rebukes Jesus. It doesn't go well. But just imagine, for Peter, this is not what he seemed to have signed on to. And he is rebuking Jesus for saying that he's going to die. And Jesus now rebukes Peter and calls all of the disciples. If anybody wants to be my disciple, let them take up their cross and follow me. And that is followed with what I call a paradoxical statement. Those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life, for my sake and for the sake of the gospel, will save it. So notice that pattern. There's the disclosure that Jesus is going to die. There is, in this case, a very inappropriate response by Simon Peter, and then there's a paradoxical statement that's made. We're going to see that again in the second disclosure. You saw the disclosure a moment ago, and in this conversation in chapter 9, Jesus asked the disciples, what were you arguing about along the way? And they didn't want to answer because they were arguing about who was the greatest. We looked at that closely a few weeks ago. And remember, so that too ends up being an inappropriate response. They're jockeying for a position. And remember, this is where Jesus takes the child and centers the child and embraces the child and uses the child as a symbol of what it means to be a disciple. And he says the paradoxical statement, whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. So again, likewise, here we have the third disclosure in chapter 10, and immediately after that, James and John come and ask Jesus for the top seats in his glory. I don't know what they think by the word glory. I don't know what Mark is thinking by the word glory. I think we've yet to see what that means, but it is something we can talk about on Wednesday. And after a bit of an exchange with James and John that we'll look at in just a moment, Jesus ends with another paradoxical statement. Whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. And then Jesus even applies that paradox to himself. So I think this context is important. While verses 35 through 45 are interesting in and of themselves, they're even more interesting in my mind when we see them as part of a three-part pattern that gets played out in these middle chapters of Mark's story. Okay, so let's turn our attention more specifically to verses 35 through 45. And we'll start with verses 35 through 37. This is where James and John come and make their request. James and John were introduced to us in chapter 3 when Mark gives us a list of the disciples. And he names them as James. And it's funny that in Mark's gospel, James is kind of named first and seems to be a little more predominant of the two. James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother to James. to whom Jesus gave the name Boanerges, which I'm not pronouncing that correctly. I'm sure nobody does, but it's a term that means sons of thunder. So one gets the impression that these are two rather boisterous people. I don't know what is behind Jesus nicknaming them sons of thunder, but they play a fairly significant role in Mark's gospel. You remember that it was James and John and Simon Peter who accompanied Jesus up to the Mount of Transfiguration. And it will be James and John, along with Simon Peter, who accompany Jesus a little further on in the garden when Jesus prays to God just before being arrested. It's kind of funny that when James and John in Mark's gospel come to Jesus asking for the right and left hand seats, in Matthew's story, Matthew's account of this story, it's not James and John, it's their mother who comes and requests this from Jesus. That's just an interesting turn in Matthew's gospel to me. And they come to Jesus and they say, we want you to grant us whatever we ask of you. Now, if you've been reading along in Mark's gospel, you probably at this point are thinking, oh no, here it comes, right? The disciples have just not shown themselves to be at a place where they have any business asking Jesus to give them carte blanche on a request. And it's always a daring thing. One should never respond yes to that kind of opening line. And in fact, Jesus does not respond yes. He asks them, what is it that you're asking for? So, you know, when I see this, I'm reminded of some of the Shakespearean plays that I've read and other medieval novels where people would go to a king and ask for a boon, ask for a favor, as it were. And it happens in the book of Esther. You know, it's not an uncommon thing. And their request to Jesus is that they are able to sit at his right and on his left. Now, I don't know exactly what they have in mind. I do want us to discuss that on Wednesday. What are they thinking? What are James and John thinking? Or in Matthew's gospel, what is their mother thinking when they ask for seats on the right and the left of Jesus in his glory? It does seem that they have a very top-down imperial structure in mind, and that they're basing this request on the structure that they see in the Roman Empire. And I only say that because I think it's indicated by the way this text works out. So, we're going to talk about the right and the left on Wednesday. Friends, please do not let me spend an entire hour with you on Wednesday without talking about this request to be on the right and the left of Jesus in his glory. Both of those terms are very, very important. So that's the request. And then we have an exchange between Jesus, James, and John. First of all, Jesus says to them, you don't know what you're asking for. And if we've read Mark's gospel from the beginning, this does not strike us as unusual. Often the narrator tells us that the disciples did not understand what Jesus was saying or what they were asking. So this is just another episode of the disciples' lack of comprehension. But Jesus follows it up, and he asks a question that's really interesting, I think. Can you drink from the cup or handle the baptism? Can you drink from the cup from which I drink? Can you handle the baptism with which I am baptized? There's a lot of sacramental language going on there. I want to suggest that as a result, we are probably listening to the formulations of Jesus' response from the early church more than from Jesus himself. I don't mean to mess with your understanding of inspiration or anything like that. I think it all works together marvelously. But Jesus doesn't make a lot of reference to his baptism in the Gospel of Mark. The story we have in Mark chapter 1, and we see that just as soon as Jesus is baptized, the Spirit comes out of the heavens like a dove, but then turns into a harpy and snatches Jesus and throws him out into the wilderness to be tempted for 40 days and 40 nights. That's the story of Jesus' baptism, and that's the only reference beyond this to Jesus' baptism in the Gospel of Mark. It's not a part of his teaching. It's not a part of his preaching. It is a part of Paul's preaching. In Romans chapter 6, Paul says, "Do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? Therefore, as we have been buried with him by baptism into death, so that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in the newness of life." It was true of the early church that they interpreted the baptism of Jesus as something in which we participate, a dying and rising in our baptism. But that's the early church. That does not seem to be how John the Baptizer presented baptism. It does not seem to be how Jesus makes any reference to his own baptism. He doesn't, outside of this text. So what I'm thinking we're hearing here is the early church. And it sounds like sacramental language because it's got the cup and the water. And I think to some extent maybe that's true, because early on in the practice of the early church, the Lord's Supper was a constant feature of how people practiced both worship and fellowship. And baptism was taken for granted in the stories of the Gospels and was certainly a practice of the early church. You can see that in the book of Acts, for example. So there is baptism, and there is a practice of the Lord's Supper, mainly the bread and the cup, in the early church. I want to be a little hesitant to read that too strongly, because it was also a matter of negotiation in the early church. What exactly constituted what we might call the sacraments? That language comes later, and while there is the language of the institution of the Lord's Supper in the story itself, just having two sacraments, baptism and the Lord's Supper, that's a very distinctive Protestant thing. And so we want to be a little reticent reading back our presumptions into the story. So it certainly does seem to be language that comes from the early church more than Jesus' teaching and preaching in the Gospels, in the Synoptic Gospels. I think you see a lot more sacramental language in John's Gospel. But I don't want to pretend that the early church had a fully fledged sacramental theology that looks just like ours, and that's what we're seeing here. So it's curious. Jesus talks about drinking this cup and handling this baptism. We do know that within the early church, there was a sense that both the cup and the baptism signified death. The cup of salvation, shed by my blood, right? My blood, and being baptized into Christ's death. I have a friend of many years who often said that it was a practice of some of the gladiators that they would drink a cup and drink to their death before they went into battle. And that was a way of showing their allegiance to the empire. I don't know if that's true or not. It's kind of a nice little illustration. So we'll assume there's some truth to it. And so this cup in baptism, later on, both took on a lot of significance with regard to the death and the resurrection of Jesus. But here, Jesus asked them, can you handle this? Can you drink the cup from which I drink? Can you be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? And James and John say yes. Wow. They have a lot of confidence. It is probably a mistake for them to have this much confidence. In the 14th chapter of Mark's Gospel, during the Last Supper, Jesus tells the disciples that they will all fall away. Simon Peter says, not me. I will never forsake you. He too has confidence. And that's when Jesus tells him that by the time the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. But what I don't want you to miss is when Simon Peter says to Jesus, I will not leave you, Mark tells us that all of them said the same. So it's not just Simon Peter. He just happens to be the loud one. They all felt that come what may, they would accompany Jesus through this baptism, through this cup, through this ordeal, through this suffering, through this death and resurrection that he was facing. And of course, we know the story. None of them accompanied Jesus there. So when we hear James and John say, yeah, we can do this. We can drink your cup. We can be baptized with your baptism. It's an unwarranted confidence that they seem to have. And you know, Jesus says, you will suffer this. But insofar as the right and the left hand, it's not mine to give. That's another thing I really want to talk about on Wednesday. Jesus says it's not my call. It's not for me to decide who will sit to my left and to my right. So now, whose call is it? And what does that mean? Again, on Wednesday, let's not miss talking about what it means to be on the left and on the right in this story. Okay? After Jesus has this exchange with James and John, well, the other 10 hear what's going on, and they're all very, very angry about it. The word translated angry is the same word we saw earlier in this chapter where people brought children to Jesus and the disciples tried to stop them and Jesus got angry. I think there it's translated indignant because we don't really like to use words like angry about Jesus. But it's the same word. The 10 were feeling the same kind of indignation that Jesus felt when Jesus saw them prohibiting children from coming to him. Now the 10 are angry because James and John are trying to get the top seats. And Jesus says something really, really powerful here. Remember, I told you in the third disclosure, Jesus focuses on being killed by the Gentiles, right? Ta ethna, the nations, it could be called. Here, Jesus says, don't be like Gentiles. Now, I don't want us to get carried away with things, but you and I are Gentiles. So let's look at ourselves here. Jesus says, don't be like those guys. My suspicion is that the Gentiles, specifically to whom Jesus is referring here, and who they should not emulate, is the Roman Empire. I think this is a very, very imperial text. I think it started under the disclosure when it turns out that it's actually the Empire of Rome that has the right and the wherewithal to kill somebody, especially if they do it by way of crucifixion. That was a uniquely Roman, torturous, obscene way of dealing with those whom they considered threats to the empire. Don't be like them, Jesus says. So I think it's worth also time for us on Wednesday to talk about when you live under the shadow of an empire like the Roman Empire for so long, at what point do you begin to internalize your oppression and emulate your oppressors. The Roman Empire was very efficient at what it did. And it seems that the 10, as well as James and John, are presuming that when Jesus comes in all of his glory, he too will be very proficient at what he does, and it will look like the Roman Empire. And Jesus does not want them to fall for that. So, the response of Jesus to the 10 is to call them out for acting like Gentiles, and then he gives the paradox. Whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first must be slave of all. That's the third iteration of that paradox of greatness that happens with all three disclosures. But this one's a little different because then there's a statement about Jesus. And Jesus is the paradox. Again, using the phrase Son of Man. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. And to be a servant to all. So now we've got Jesus himself being the paradox, not simply telling people to act that way. It's a significant point because the paradoxes that we've heard before, they're not just about disciples. They are defining what Jesus is, who Jesus is, and how Jesus is the Christ. And you know, what's really notable here is that Jesus says he came to serve and to give his life. He doesn't say, but it's okay because I'll be raised on the third day and everything's going to be real happy. At no point does the promise of resurrection, which is part of all three disclosures, at no point does the promise of being raised somehow take away the tragedy and the anxiety and guilt of being betrayed and suffering and being put to death, handed over by the Jewish leadership and put to death by the empire. At no point does the promise of resurrection gloss over that and say, you know, we'll just put up with it for a little bit, it'll all be fine. It's there, resurrection is there, but the pain between this moment and resurrection is real. And then Jesus says that the Son of Man gives his life as a ransom for many. This is the one and only time that this term is used in Mark's Gospel. It is also in Matthew's version of this story, and that's it in the New Testament. This is not a common New Testament term. My suggestion, again, would be that perhaps this is the early church talking, and Jesus' life and death and resurrection as a ransom for many became one of the metaphors that meant a lot to the early church as they were reckoning with why Jesus had to die. Again, I think it's the language of the early church, not necessarily the language of Jesus himself in this moment. And that's reflected in the way Mark tells the story. So that's a lot. And we left a lot on the table to discuss on Wednesday. So I hope you're there, and I hope to see you then. Thanks. Bye.